Philosophy is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. We will see that concepts need conceptual personae that play a part in their definition. Friend is one such persona that is even said to reveal the Greek origin of philosophy. Other civilizations had sages, but the Greeks introduced these friends, who are not just more modest sages. The old Oriental sage thinks, perhaps, in figures, whereas the philosopher invents and thinks the concepts. The question is important because the friend who appears in philosophy no longer stands for an extrinsic persona, an example or empirical circumstance, but rather for a presence that is intrinsic to thought, a condition of possibility of thought, itself a living category, a transcendental lived reality. With the creation of philosophy, the Greeks violently forced the friend into a relationship that is no longer a relationship with an other, but with an entity, an objectality, an essence. Plato's friend, but even more the friend of wisdom, of truth, or the concept. The philosopher is the concept's friend. She is potentiality of the concept. The object of philosophy is to create concepts that are always new. Sciences, arts, and philosophies are all equally creative, although only philosophy creates concepts in the strict sense. Plato said that ideas must be contemplated, but first of all he had to create the concept of idea. Philosophy is not contemplation, for contemplation are things themselves as seen in the creation of their specific concepts. It is not reflection, because no one needs philosophy to reflect on anything. Nor does philosophy find any final refuge in communication, which only works under the sway of opinions in order to create consensus and not concepts. Philosophy does not contemplate, reflect, or communicate, although it must create concepts for these actions or passions. The first principle of philosophy is that universals explain nothing, but must themselves be explained. According to the Nietzschean verdict, you will know nothing through concepts unless you have first created them, that is, constructed them in an intuition specific to them, a field, a plane, and a ground that must not be confused with them, but that shelters their seeds in the personae who cultivate them. The concept's baptism calls for a specifically philosophical taste that proceeds with violence or by insinuation, constitutes a philosophical language within language, not just a vocabulary but a syntax that attains the sublime or great beauty. What unity remains for philosophies, it will be asked, if concepts constantly change? There are no simple concepts. Every concept has components and is defined by them. It therefore has a combination, chiffre. It is a multiplicity, although not every multiplicity is conceptual. There is no concept with only one component. Even the first concept, the one with which a philosophy begins, has several components, because it is not obvious that philosophy must have a beginning, and if it does determine one, it must combine it with a point of view, or a ground, and raison. Even so-called universals, as ultimate concepts, must escape the chaos by circumscribing a universe that explains them. Contemplation, reflection, communication. We go from one concept to another by a kind of bridge. The creation of a concept of the other person with these components will entail the creation of a new concept of perceptual space, with other components to be determined. Every concept relates back to other concepts, not only in its history, but in its becoming, or its present connections. Every concept has components that may in turn be grasped as concepts. Face will itself be considered as a concept, with its own components. Concepts therefore extend to infinity, and being created are never created from nothing. What is distinctive about the concept is that it renders components inseparable within itself. Components, or what defines the consistency of the concept, its endo-consistency, are distinct, heterogeneous, and yet not separable. For example, in the concept of the other person, the possible world does not exist outside the face that expresses it, although it is distinguished from it as expressed an expression, and the face in turn is the vicinity for the words for which it is already the megaphone. The concept is real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. The concept is defined by its consistency, its endo-consistency, and its exo-consistency, but it has no reference. It is self-referential. It posits itself and its object at the same time as it is created. Constructivism unites the relative and the absolute. Finally, the concept is not discursive, and philosophy is not a discursive formation, because it does not link propositions together. Confusing concept and proposition produces a belief in the existence of scientific concepts, and the view of the proposition as a genuine intention. Consequently, the philosophical concept usually appears only as a proposition deprived of sense. This confusion reigns in logic, and explains its infantile idea of philosophy. Even bridges from one concept to another are still junctions or detours, which do not define any discursive whole. They are movable bridges. From this point of view, philosophy can be seen as being in a perpetual state of digression, or digressiveness. In the case of propositions, proper names designate extrinsic partial observers that are scientifically definable in relation to a particular axis of reference, whereas for concepts, proper names are intrinsic, conceptual personae who haunt a particular plane of consistency. It is not only proper names that are used very differently in philosophy, science, arts, but also syntactical elements, and therefore prepositions and the conjunctions now, therefore. At present we are relying only on a very general hypothesis from sentences, or their equivalent. Philosophy extracts concepts, which must not be confused with general or abstract ideas, whereas science extracts prospects, propositions that must not be confused with judgments, and art extracts percepts and affects, which must not be confused with perceptions or feelings. Every concept has a phase space, although not in the same way as in science. The same goes for modes of thought, feeling, imagination, having ideas, and also for types of being, thing, or substance. Infinite being, finite thinking being, extended being. So among my ideas, I have the idea of infinity. It is the bridge leading from the concept of self to the concept of God. To criticize is only to establish that a concept vanishes when it is thrust into a new milieu, losing some of its components or acquiring others that transform it. The task of philosophy when it creates concepts entities is always to extract an event from things and beings, to set up the new event from things and beings, always to give them a new event, space, time, matter, thought, the possible as events. But philosophical concepts are fragmentary wholes that are not aligned with one another, so that they fit together because their edges do not match up. They are not pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but rather the outcome of throws of the dice. They resonate nevertheless, and philosophy that creates them always introduces a powerful whole, that while remaining open is not fragmented, an unlimited one-all, an omnitudo that includes all the concepts on one and the same plane, is a table, a plateau, or a slice. It is a plane of consistency, or more accurately, the plane of immanence of concepts, the planomenon. Concepts and plane are strictly correlative, but nevertheless the two should not be confused. The plane of immanence is neither a concept nor the concept of all concepts. If one were to be confused with the other, there would be nothing to stop concepts from forming a single one or becoming universals and losing their singularity. The plane would also lose its openness. Philosophy is a constructivism, and constructivism has two qualitatively different complementary aspects: the creation of concepts and the laying out of a plane. Concepts are like multiple waves, rising and falling. The plane of eminence is the single wave that rolls them and unrolls them. The plane of eminence is not a concept that is or can be thought, but rather the image of thought, the image that gives itself of what it means to think, to make use of thought, to find one's bearings in thought. It is not a method, since every method is concerned with concepts and presupposes such an image. Neither is it a state of knowledge in the brain and its functioning. Even thought that here is not related to slow brain. Blah, blah. If turning toward is the movement of thought towards truth, how could truth not also turn towards thought? When Heraclitus's thought becomes polemos, it is fire that retorts. It is a single speed on both sides. The atom will traverse space with the speed of thought. The plane of eminence has two facets, as thought and as nature, as nous and as physis. This is why there are always many infinite movements caught within each other, each folded in the others, so that the return of one instantaneously relaunches another, in such a way that the plane of eminence is ceaselessly being woven, like a gigantic shuffle. Even the negative produces infinite movements, falling into error as much as avoiding the false, allowing oneself to be dominated by passions as much as overcoming. Diverse movements of the infinite are so mixed in with each other, far from breaking up the one all of the plane of eminence, they constitute its variable curvature, its concavities and convexities, its fractal nature, as it were. It is this fractal nature that makes the phenomenon an infinite that is always different from any surface or volume, determinable as a concept. Elements of the plane are diagrammatic features, whereas concepts are intensive features. The former are movements of the infinite, whereas the latter are intensive ordinates of these movements, like original sections, or differential positions, finite movements in which the infinite is now only speed, and each of which constitutes a surface or a volume, an irregular contour making a halt in the degree of proliferation. The former are directions that are fractal in nature, whereas the latter are absolute dimensions, intensively defined, always fragmentary surfaces or volumes. The former are intuitions, and the latter are intentions. If philosophy begins with the creation of concepts, then the plane of eminence must be regarded as pre-philosophical. Pre-philosophical does not mean something pre-existent, but rather something that does not exist outside philosophy, although philosophy presupposes it. These are its internal conditions. One does not think without becoming something else, something that does not think. An animal, a molecule, a particle, and that comes back to thought and revives it. The plane of eminence is like a section of chaos, and acts like a sieve. In fact, chaos is characterized less by the absence of determinations than by the infinite speed with which they take shape and vanish. Chaos makes chaotic and undoes every consistency in the infinite. The problem of philosophy is to acquire a consistency without losing the infinite into which thought plunges. In this respect, chaos has as much a mental as physical existence. To give consistency without losing anything of the infinite is very different from the problem of science, which seeks to provide chaos with reference points. Artaud said the plane of consciousness, or limitless plane of eminence, what the Indians call Saiguri, also engenders hallucinations, erroneous perceptions, bad feelings. We must draw up a list of these illusions and take their measure, just as Nietzsche, following Spinoza, listed the 4 great errors, but the list is infinite. First of all, there is the illusion of transcendence, which perhaps first comes before all others. in its double aspect of making immanence immanent to something, and of rediscovering a transcendence within immanence itself. Then the illusion of universals, when concepts are confused with the plane. But this confusion arises as soon as immanence is posited as being immanent to something, since this something is necessarily a concept. We think the universal explains, whereas it is what must be explained, and we fall into a triple illusion, that of contemplation or reflection or communication. Then there is the illusion of the eternal, when it is forgotten that concepts must be created, the illusion of discursiveness, when propositions are confused with concepts. It would be wrong to think that all these illusions logically entail one another like propositions, but they resonate or reverberate and form a thick fog around the plane. From chaos, the plane of immanence takes the determinations with which it makes its infinite movements or its diagrammatic features. Consequently, we can and must presuppose a multiplicity of planes, since no one plane could encompass all of chaos without collapsing back into it, and each retains only movements which can be folded together. The history of philosophy exhibits so many distinct planes, not just as results of illusions, and not merely because each plane has its own constantly renewed way of restoring transcendence. More profoundly, it is because each plane has its own way of constructing immanence. Each plane carries out a selection of that which is due to thought by right, but this selection varies from one plane to another. The plane of immanence is interleaved. What violence must be exerted on thought for us to become capable of thinking? What violence of an infinite movement that, at the same time, takes from us our power to say I. Mental landscapes do not change haphazardly through the ages. A mountain had to rise here, or a river to flow by. There again, recently, for the ground, now dry and flat, to have a particular appearance and texture. Philosophy is becoming, not history. It is the coexistence of planes, not the succession of systems. We will say that the plane of immanence is at the same time that which must be thought and that which cannot be thought. It is the non-thought within thought. It is the base of all planes, immanent to every thinkable plane that does not succeed in thinking it. It is the most intimate within thought, and yet the absolute outside, an outside more distant than any external world, because it is an inside deeper than any internal world. It is immanence, intimacy as the outside, the exterior become the instrument, the intrusion that stifles, and the reversal of both the one and the other. The incessant toing and froing of the plane, infinite movement. Perhaps this is the supreme act of philosophy, not so much to think the plane of immanence as to show it is there, unthought in every plane, and to think it in this way as the outside and inside of thought, as the not external outside and not internal inside, that which cannot be thought and yes must be thought, which was thought once as Christ was incarnated, once in order to show that one time the possibility of the impossible. The philosopher is the idiosyncrasy of his conceptual personae. The destiny of the philosopher is to become his conceptual persona or personae, at the same time that these personae themselves become something other than what they are historically, mythologically, or commonly. The conceptual persona is the becoming or the subject of a philosophy, on a par with the philosopher, so that Nicholas of Acusa, I will as Zarathustra, I dance as Dionysus, I claim as lover. In philosophical enunciations, we do not do something by saying it, but produce movement by thinking it, to the intermediacy of a conceptual persona. Conceptual personae are also the true agents of enunciation. Who is I? Is always a third person, Becoming is not being, and Dionysus becomes philosopher at the same time that Nietzsche becomes Dionysus. Art thinks no less than philosophy, but thinks through affects and percepts. The role of conceptual personae is to show thought's territories, its absolute deterritorializations and reterritorializations. Conceptual personae are thinkers, solely thinkers, and their personalized features are closely linked to diagrammatic features of thought, the intensive features of concepts. A particular conceptual persona, who perhaps did not exist before us, thinks in us.